Hi, good morning, good evening, or whatever time you are watching this recorded presentation. I hope that you are having a good day and ready to learn with me. I am Ranger Prius, and the topic that we would be discussing for this lesson is race and diversity in workplace. So, in this chapter of the unit, we would be discussing how the race is being represented as protected category of diversity in the workplace. This chapter will discuss the racism as a social justice issue in the workplace because of race diversity. This chapter will disclose the historical perspective of race and will introduce sociological and theoretical perspectives for studying racism as consequences of race diversity in the workplace. So, the first thing that we would do is define first these following terms that we are about to encounter and know how to differentiate them. First is race. So, race is a socially constructed category that denotes differences among people. The term race is politically sustained to categorize people according to the specific group grouping humans based on shared physical or social qualities into categories generally viewed as a distinct by society. So the other term is ethnicity. This term has been used as an interchangeable term of race. So ethnicity is a term that is a more contemporary denote different cultures and origins. So we must always remember that race is often perceived as something that's inherent in our biology and therefore inherited across generations. Meanwhile, ethnicity, on the other hand, is typically understood as something we acquired or self ascribed based on factors like where we live or the culture we share with others. Make sure to remember the differences between them because the two terms can be confusing. Don't confuse these two terms anymore. Okay? So, sociological theoretical perspectives for studying race. So, there are two theories that are discussed in this chapter the constructionist and structural theories. Constructionists are structural theories both acknowledge that race and ethnicity are social constructs that shape how people are situated within a larger society. But these two theories also differ in many aspects, and we will discover that in the next slides. So this is the table for the constructionist and structural theories, and these are their differences and how they contradict on each other's theories. So first, the constructionist theory focus on group characteristics. Meanwhile, the structural focus on antagonism created by the group. The constructionist theories narrow the view of racism. As a result, the constructionist approach does not adequately address the problem of racism, which is deeply embedded within and institutionalized practices within society. So, meanwhile, The structural theory has a broad view of racism. The constructionist theory focuses on culture, ideology, and identity. Meanwhile, the structural focuses more on power. The constructionist theory is a byproduct of economic, political, and social forces. As those forces change, pseudo racial and ethnic products. So, the structural theory is a product of economic, political, and social forces. Structuralists would add that the creation of racism is a byproduct of economic, political, and social forces, actions upon race and ethnicity. In constructionist theory, groups contribute in the making and creating their identities. Meanwhile, on structural, groups are categorized. On a constructionist theory, it is static. Meanwhile, on a structural, they see it as changing. Structuralists would add that as time passes, categories are subject to change, particularly as people struggle to assign other people to them as products of social change, circumstances, human interpretation, and social action. Race and ethnicity are not static, but rather variable, diverse, and contingent upon social arenas such as politics, labor markets, residential space, social institutions, culture, and daily experiences. So, it is said that in a constructionist theory, it is a free floating ideology. It means that if it is a free floating ideology, groups contribute to the making and sustaining of their identities. Therefore, constructionists are concerned with how groups form and construct identity and how people within groups conceptualize themselves and others. Meanwhile, on a structural theory, it is structural and embedded. On a constructionist theory, it is psychological and irrational. Meanwhile, on a structural theory, it is systematic and rational. In a constructionist theory, it is based on historicity. Meanwhile, on structural, it is based on contemporary structure. On a constructionist theory, it is a overt behavior. Meanwhile, on structural, it is both the overt and covert behavior. Structuralist approaches will say that racism today is more covert and subtle in nature due to its embedded position within institutionalized practices that are controlled by whites. And that's all for the contrast of the constructionist and structural theory. You can review it and compare those two again. So some theories advances their own interpretation in an effort to render a deeper understanding of how race and ethnicity shape our lives. So it represents six selected theories or interpretation of a structural and a constructionist theory. So these are the selected theories from the constructionist and structural approaches. So, first, under the constructionist theory, is the racial formation. The racial formation theory, suggested by Omi and Venant in 1994, suggests that to some extent we all learn some technique to categorize people, whether we are consciously aware of it or not. The racial formation theory seeks to address the topics of historicity, group identity, and social comprehensiveness, as well as account for the way individuals and groups has to manage conflictual racial meanings and everyday experiences. Second is racialization. Like Bonilla Silva in 1997 presents a strong argument from a structural perspective for a theorization of race and ethnicity that uses the concept of racialization. Last is Ethnic Identity by Nichols in 1994. Study of ethnic identity is a constructionist approach that addresses how ethnic groups are negotiated, defined, and produced through social interaction inside and outside ethnic communities. Nagel does not emphasize race and ethnicity, but rather ethnicity and culture. In doing so, the element of historicity is taken away, but the dimension of boundaries is added. Nagel's approach is useful for accommodating the issue of immigration. Boundaries determine who is a member and who is not, and designates which ethnic categories are available for individual identification at any point in time. Next is we have the ender in structural theory. First, under this theory is the theory of oppression. Fig in 2006 advances a structural approach based on a theory of oppression. Fagan points out that while discrimination has been made illegal, institutionalized practices such as employment, education, and other practices within the public domain still allow racism. These structures dominate society because white officials at all levels of the government who rarely take aggressive action to significantly reduce racial discrimination in the US. Next is the study of whiteness. Lewis 2004 suggests that all people within society are racialized, including whites. Lewis acknowledged the structure of racial hierarchy, but questions how can race be structural and embedded, yet superficial, arbitrary, and whimsical, shifting with times and circumstances? Studies of race and ethnicity do not adequately account for whiteness, or how whites are a part of a structure that have created and sustained a racialized society. Understanding the relationship between the daily performance of race and larger racial structure is key to our understanding of how race works more generally and to how it shapes the lives of whites. Last is the structural theory. Bonilla Silva in 1997 argues the central problem of the various approaches to the study of racial phenomena is their lack of structural theory of racism. Bonilla Silva's position is that when race emerged as a social construct, This racialized system resulted in privileging some groups over others. In the case of US society, whites assume a privilege over blacks and other people of color. So next we would be discussing about the racism in the United States. So first, let's define racism. Racism is a process whereby socialized racist notions become integrated with the actions and practices such a way that these actions and practices become actualized and reinforced through routine and situations. Racism is a racial prejudice sustained by power, privilege, and resources. The term racism is also related to concepts such as discrimination, prejudice, and stereotypes. Actions of discrimination, prejudice, and stereotypes can also be viewed as unjust social behaviors, attitudes, or beliefs. It is very essence. Racism involves not only negative attitudes and beliefs, but also social power to disadvantage some groups of people, and at the same time, it offers advantages to other groups. This thing didn't just happen in the past, but it is still prevailing till this day. The BLM or the Black Lives Matter campaign and the Stop Asian Hate has been a hot topic because of the discrimination that people that belong to this group had been facing, especially in the US. And watching those just breaks my heart. For real. I just hope that one day we could live a life without this racism and live not just by our race, but accepting everyone without discrimination. So, according to Jones, there are two types of racism at social levels: the individual racism and the institutional racism. So, what is individual racism? Individual racism refers to an individual's racist assumptions, beliefs, or behaviors, and is a form of racial discrimination that stems from conscious and unconsciousness personal prejudice. Individual racism can be expressed both overtly and covertly. Overt racism is intentional, and the motives of the perpetrators are clearly expressed. On the other hand, covert racism is more subtle or hidden, and the perpetrator's motives are difficult to detect. In contrast to overt and covert racism, the video in Gartner identified overt racism, which represents a subtle, often unintentional form of bias. This bias projects itself through harsh racial feelings and beliefs that are developed unconsciously. Next type of racism is institutional racism. Institutional racism reflects the differential effects of policies, practices, and laws on the certain members of a certain racial groups. Institutional racism developed from intentional racism, such as limiting immigration and the voting rights of a certain racial groups. Next is a persistence of racism in the workplace. According to Bonella Silva, avoiding discussions of racism allows individuals to hide their true racial viewpoints. Acknowledging racism is necessary not only for those subjected to the experience or the individual level, but also for those involved in policy making, practices, and procedures in an institutional level. For example, former US President Obama was elected as a president. It was a big step to show that racism don't exist anymore since a black president has been elected. But no, the racism continued, that even they attack derogatory depiction of the president as a monkey or with exaggerated physical features along with other demeaning attacks on the president and Michelle Obama targeted their identity as a African Americans rather than targeting their political views or affiliation. Attacking the President of the United States in such a blatant, stereotypical, and racist and disrespectful way casts a shadow on the prevalence of racism in the society. So next, we will be uncovering racism. The past light, I have a extreme feelings with that because of what happened. So let's move on. Uncovering racism in diversity. For better discussion of this, I have created a simple illustration for this. You can see in the illustration that our final destination is diversity in workplace. And we started it with diversity as an individual, as a person. But throughout the way, there are the assumptions, and perceptions of a certain race that is resulted to unwelcoming attitude and cooperation of some employee, and that would be a hindrance for us to get to our dream goal of a diversity in a workplace. This is the sad truth. Some people have their prejudice, and their prejudice are hard to break. And because of this discrimination, racism starts resurfacing in the workplace. Next is emerging perspective on racism and a social justice issue. We are still conditioning people in this country, and indeed all over the globe, to the myth of white superiority. We are constantly being told that we don't have racism in this country anymore. But most of the people who are saying that are white because they don't experience racism. They're the one doing it most of the time. Racialized language feeds the system of racism and allows it to persist through political categorization and institutionalized practices within our society. To contest this categorization would still remain a government controlled process, which means how a person experiences race remains under the power and control of the state. Shifting this power from the state is a matter of social advocacy and perhaps a new social movement. So that is all for my report about race and diversity in the workforce. And now, let's proceed to the next reporter, Miss Rika Comedja.